Hello, welcome to the Better Outcomes Show, where we explore the possibilities of a new healthcare. Each episode, we bring you a conversation with leaders across the healthcare industry, exploring topics ranging from new treatment techniques and interventions to novel service delivery methods and business models. And now your host, Rafi Salazar from Rehab Practice Solutions, a leader in patient engagement and retention strategy. Let's explore the possibilities of a new healthcare.
Well, hello again. Welcome to another episode of the Better Outcomes Show. I'm your host, Rafi Salazar from rehabilitation.com. And if you're looking for a way to attract, acquire, engage, and retain more patients at your clinic or healthcare organization, you can head on over to rehabilitation.com and learn more about what we do and how we do it and how working with us works. You can find that information at www.rehab-practice-solutions.com. That's rehab, the letter U, practice-solutions.com. Alrighty, on to this week's episode. I am having a conversation here with Josh Pappas from Forbes. Now, we talk about remote patient monitoring, and I'm going to let him tell you about kind of the data and how it all works and really what we mean by remote patient monitoring and kind of the applications for use in clinical settings and what it means for patient engagement and reimbursement and all of that. Forbes is a digital health company, and it's basically aimed at using software-based therapeutics to provide better outcomes for patients, smarter engagement and tracking tools for clinicians, and cost-effective solutions for payers. So again, when we look at healthcare and the different stakeholders in the game, you've got the 4 Ps, right? You've got the payer, the provider, the patient, and the policymaker. And any tool that's really going to get mass adoption or really become a viable treatment option or tool in the healthcare space really needs to address all 4 of those payers effectively, or at least meet the needs of all 4 of those payers. And I know on previous episodes, we had conversations about what each of those stakeholders desires, right? The different value points for each of those. And it's different depending on where you are in the value chain or in where you are in perspective. Like if you are a payer, what is valuable to you is going to be different than if you are a patient, right? A patient is looking for a seamless experience, as low of a barrier to entry or to use as possible. They want it to be pleasant, user-friendly. Same thing almost with providers, right? They want to be able to, one, be reimbursed for it, so it needs to be financially viable for them, but it needs to be something that's going to be efficient for them to use. They can't spend extra time and extra resources implementing a tool. And then payers are, again, wanting to know that if you're going to implement this tool, if they're going to use it, they're going to reimburse for it, that it's going to end up saving them money in the long run. And then policymakers, again, are worried more about the regulatory impacts of it all. What does it mean for patient care? How does it redefine patient care and that sort of thing? So we talked a little bit about that in this conversation. But basically, if you're new to the idea of remote patient monitoring, go and read about it. I know we've done some articles on the website about it. We've talked about asynchronous telehealth and remote and virtual service delivery here on the show before, so you can go check out some of those older episodes. But without further ado, here's Josh Pappas talking about remote patient monitoring. Well, hey, Josh, welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing good. Hope you're doing all right.
Oh, yes. I'm doing great. Looking forward to talking about remote patient monitoring. But before we dive into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this field.
Yeah, fantastic. So I kind of stumbled upon remote patient monitoring before it was cool, so to speak. So I spent really good amount of my early career working at the physician group setting, kind of North Carolina, and then broader in the Southeast. And so, various different products. I kind of, dipped my toe in the water in the startup world, which was exciting, in some diagnostic genetics. But really kind of, I was in Orangeburg, South Carolina, believe it or not, very rural part of South Carolina, and was talking to a doctor, and he asked me, hey, have you heard of this remote patient monitoring? It seems like, something's coming from CMS, and It kind of unlocked really what I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, that one conversation. So really, I uncovered the opportunity, started to work with some earlier stage companies that had some really cool solutions, New York, Seattle. Really, they were trying to bridge their technology and bring it and get some feedback from the clinician and the care teams in the ambulatory setting. So, through that journey, I was a consultant for lots of different companies, kind of being able to give a pulse of what was feasible in the outpatient setting, and was an early stage hire at one of those companies as well. Really bringing remote patient monitoring more broadly to kind of groups all over the U.S.
Yeah, cool deal. So I know that folks have probably heard, at least on the periphery, about what remote patient monitoring is, but for those who may be new to the idea of it, or maybe have just heard about it and are kind of exploring it, can you define for us what is remote patient monitoring, and then how it works kind of from a patient perspective, and maybe even what it does for the provider as well?
Yeah, fantastic. So it's important to note that remote patient monitoring in its very basic form has been around forever, right?
Yeah.
I went to a talk at Health, and one of the physicians there said the old remote patient monitoring was the fax machine, right? So it's evolved, but really I think what brought remote patient monitoring to its forefront was when CMS really adopted some newer CPT codes, because what it did was, and those CPT codes are, at the core that we'll kind of talk about today, is the 99453, the 99454, the 99457, and then most recently the 99458. Really, when those came to light, it allowed for more broader adoption of remote patient monitoring, because prior to that, there was kind of one legacy code that was a 99091, and it was great in theory, but the challenge was it actually was about 30 minutes of the physician's, the provider's time spent reviewing the data or interacting with that, and for $60 it just didn't make sense for
Yeah.
a clinician to spend he or she's time on that. So with these new codes, the Medicare basically expected there to be this widespread adoption. Now there was a lot of, in typical fashion, there was a lot of confusion and ambiguity. So really, when they launched it, CMS, you had some early adopted, and we were part of kind of the forefront with some of the companies I was working for. So there was some good adoption, but it left more to be really desired. They actually were surprised at the lack of adoption, and there's various different reasons why, but I think that the main reason is there was really not that shift in healthcare. I mean, I can remember sitting in a lot of the early conversations where we're consulting with doctors and said, what, Josh, this seems like a great idea. The challenges, all the other challenges I'm sure you talk about with your typical office and staffing and this or that. Now, this was right around 2019, and I said, what, Josh, I think this is great, but next year on the cycle, I don't even think Medicare is going to continue to have this, right? Like along with other I think that they're not going to have these codes even in place.
Yeah.
Then what happened is kind of the monumental shift was COVID-19. And that really propelled an already kind of existing infrastructure to the forefront in a couple different ways, right? So a lot of times this was by necessity a way for physicians to be able to connect with their patients when there was no that period of time when there was really no office visits, but then it also too in the kind of the ambulatory setting provided a real lifeline for for getting reimbursement and understanding, offering a great service to the patient. Being able to only really time management, RPM also allowed them from a time management perspective to only kind of address the patients who really needed the attention because there was kind of a lack of staffing. So COVID was a catalyst there. And then I think moving forward now, what I've seen is it's somewhat of a mainstay, and that's kind of solidified. I think we mentioned at the beginning to be able to go to Health, and now it's kind of what is RPM 2.0 going to look like. But I think I was fortunate enough to work with lots of different organizations, different specialties that really embraced it, helped set up. It's certainly not an easy process, but have seen great results and have kind of expanded their RPM programs.
Yeah, because for a while, RPM was really only for physicians, right? And then these new codes came out and it kind of expanded it to other ancillary healthcare providers, right?
Yeah, exactly. And to give you, the highest level, right? I always recommend, working with the local mats and things like that. But at highest level, really what the codes, kind of the different codes. So the 453, if you want to think about it in a very broad sense, it's kind of a setup and education code. So really it's involving with, consenting the patient. A lot of times in practice, to get the buy-in, it's really helpful when the physician in office kind of, just has a nice conversation with the patient on what they're going to be a part of. A lot of times with that conversation, the patient is like, wow, this seems fantastic. I'm going to get this connected blood pressure cuff. But really that first code is kind of the setup and education and getting them started. So that's a one-time reimbursable code. And then, majority of the kind of ongoing codes are the 454, which really in spirit of what Medicare does, really wanted to do, right, was to basically reimburse for providing. They know it's going to be, you have to provide an infrastructure. It's not an infrastructure that really exists in your traditional, clinic setting. So really what they were doing is providing an FDA approved connected device. And where they've kind of doubled down now, with the nuances of the codes, is that that basic whatever vital it is, and it could be blood pressure, pulse ox, weight are kind of the most common. It could be more than that, but at least kind of one, to be able to kind of stream data at least 16 days over a 30-day period. Lots of confusion there, there and some ambiguity, but I think that's kind of, the main takeaway is, for greater than one half of that 30-day period, kind of having enough data from whatever data set there is, kind of streaming from the patient to, to the physician office from a remote perspective. And to your point, a lot of the adoption and the reason why it truly is kind of a whole office program is they realized that the stakeholders that were actually running these programs, or MAs, RNs, a lot of the kind of the unsung heroes within the physician office, that could really, move the needle from a clinical perspective. So the other two codes are, like to think of them as a communication and interaction, code, where it's basically a time code over a calendar month for everything involved with dealing with a remote patient monitoring program. So obviously that's reaching out to the patients. The nice part about telehealth programs was being able to, being able to see a problem and then reach out to the problem, but then be compensated, that MA or RN, being compensated for their time spent reviewing the data, interacting with the patient. And so, from that perspective, it's good from a, coding perspective, because, it allows for capture of non kind of, provider time that it takes to kind of have a successful program. So a very broad way of describing those, those codes, but that's kind of the crux of what we kind of termed in the fee for service, where, the kind of that remote patient monitoring codes and who's involved.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned, so this is one of those, this is a type of program where basically you need some sort of FDA approved device, right? So is there a list of devices that work with these codes, or is it as long as it's FDA approved, you can implement it into your RPM program?
Yeah. So speaking from my experience, there's a couple different ways that, that it's been. It's more the latter. As long as that's FDA approved device, and it's kind of, being able to get that, the 16-day of readings, that's where there's not some very strict terms and conditions on, what it has to be, right? And that may evolve in some with the new codes, that may evolve. But one of the key areas where we've seen really in the outpatient, more chronic RPM setting, when the patient has that, and they're not like a high risk patient, because there's varying levels of RPM, right? For a post-acute program, it's really not focused on the codes. It's kind of focused on being more intensive, getting more data. Whereas in kind of, the ambulatory setting, which we're kind of covering today with RPM codes, is it's almost wanting to engage the patient, but realizing that that adherence is going to be. So in terms of the device, there's kind of two main types of devices. There's Bluetooth enabled devices. So think about a Bluetooth blood pressure cuff. It kind of, connects to a smartphone and then transmits the data. Well, the challenge is, it's a 65 and up, it's a Medicare population.
Yeah.
So one of the great programs, and it's not specific to one company, I think it's more widespread now, to actually eliminate the need for the connectivity, the challenges there. And they actually use cellular enabled BP cuffs and scales or pulse ox. So to walk you through what that looks like is, once they're enrolled in the program, they're sent home, but the device itself is kind of LTE enabled. So it eliminates the connectivity where it's kind of a set it and forget it. patient takes, regular touch points, takes a BP, and very simply, it transmits from device to essentially whatever platform that the provider has. So I remember being in a lot of the doctor's offices and educating the patients, and they were excited about that. And normally that's when you're going to really see the adherence rates go up. And a lot of those are FDA approved devices, but the cellular seems to be a great avenue when it's more of a chronic RPM program that is seen kind of most commonly in the ambulatory setting.
Yeah, because you're not having to deal with like connecting to an app and doing all that. As far as the security measures, so now you're talking about transmitting data. Like, how is that usually handled? Do most of these platforms, I'm assuming most of these platforms have some sort of encrypted end-to-end encryption type deal to protect the data, but is that something that is on the provider defined, or are most of these devices kind of just coming out of the gate equipped with this kind of security feature in place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll add a caveat. I'm no security expert. However, what I can vouch for is pretty much even as small as a single provider group up to a health system, and I've worked with all of them. There's usually lots of different focus on security, whether that's your questionnaire. So pretty much the majority of the platforms go through a pretty rigorous vetting process for HIPAA, high trust. But I think that the privacy and the security and the data are kind of always forefront of the conversation, and it is emerging. I think at a very basic level, a lot of the the FDA, and then also to FDA approved the devices and the platform itself have the appropriate security measures on the forefront to to help the doctors. But that's kind of constantly evolving, and kind of the own organization have their varying levels of kind of security questionnaires. But I've been a part of enough where that could be the bulk of understanding the technology is one, but then going through the pages and pages of security protocol is a very important aspect. But normally that's done on the front end. It's kind of the vendor vetting process, so that once you're going into production, all of those per organization have kind of been checking the box, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, backing up to like patient adherence and the whole connectivity thing, and getting these devices that are kind of set it and forget it. As far as, let's say, over the last maybe 18, 36 months or something like that, what has patient adherence to these programs looked like? And has it changed with the advent of, one, the whole COVID and people not coming into the office, so there being more of an emphasis on trying to get these touch points in with these patients? And is it one of those things that we kind of see increasing, like as more and more physicians and physician groups and clinicians begin adopting it, that it's becoming more mainstream? Or is patient adherence always a challenge with some of these?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think probably, based on my experience, so more broad, statistics, right? A couple of different studies, here recently, 4 in 5 consumers, right? So 80% of Americans kind of favor actually using remote patient monitoring, as to kind of incorporate into their treatment plan in the primary care, right? So I think that goes to show you that patients are kind of looking for some of those areas, and that could be, determined based on, COVID, or kind of in response to COVID. So what I've seen kind of at a more basic level in my experience is, patient adherence is really at the forefront of a lot of companies, or it should be, right? In the companies, I think, that are innovating there, but patient adherence has lots of different, I guess, manifestations. And so at the front end, it's interesting. So patient adherence normally involves kind of adopting into the program. And so sometimes, especially at the beginning, doctors felt like they were having to kind of almost sell the patient on this program, being another additional service. So a lot of times, the companies that did it successfully kind of worked in partnership, and it was driven by the physician, because there's been lots of, there's lots of variations of remote patient monitoring. But one of the key takeaways that I've seen is when it's driven by kind of the physician and call it the practice, wherever that is, whether it's primary care, cardiology, that actually has a really good way of getting the patient to at least, adopt in, right? When it's driven by the insurance company or something else, that adoption rate really dramatically drops, meaning that the physician, the patient kind of trusts that physician relationship. So at just a very adoption rate there. I have seen that that unfortunately, because of the 16-day requirement to kind of get paid, that has potentially stunted the growth. And that's unfortunate because, in some ways, I think it's trying to make sure that there's utilization there and that's clinically actionable data. But, the jury's out on, in my opinion, on if every single condition needs, kind of an arbitrary number of 16 days. But because of that, a lot of the programs have various levels of compliance. So where it's built into the system to kind of remind and compliant. And then there are also varying levels of services that can be added, right? Lots of companies have compliance level services where either themselves or the office will reach out to the patient, and all of that kind of is captured in that 457 and 458. Because that time, kind of the clock is ticking, and they can get reimbursed for that time because the patient adherence is a very key metric for not only the success clinically, but also the success for some of the coding and making sure it's there. So I would say it's top of mind there. But just from a patient experience perspective, and I was fortunate enough to work kind of with lots of different clinics, and even in a pre-COVID world or early COVID, working some RPM programs in the office, and the overall feedback from family members and caregivers was, wow, this is such a kind of matter of fact, but an awesome service to especially in some of the rural areas, to offer, my loved one. And, a lot of times there's patients that were just coming into the office to get their, blood pressure taken, or maybe going to the CVS. And so I think in that regard, getting the patient adherence, but then also to, the patients themselves, or sometimes even the family members, really supported this program and have been on it for a long-term time. Even maybe after they're initially were supposed to do it, they want to stay on the program just to have that extra set of eyes.
Yeah. Well, you kind of mentioned about payers and if it's being pushed by insurance. What about these devices? Like I'm assuming these devices are not cheap, especially the ones that are like LTE enabled. So how is that paid for from a patient perspective? Are they shelling out the money for this, or is this something that insurances are reimbursing for? Like how does the whole money side of things work? Not just outside of like the CBT codes that the provider's billing, but the actual device itself.
Yeah. So, and it's a good point. I think there are, there's no shortage of many different, wearable devices just outside even remote monitoring. And some are very, specific and they're broad use case. And now there's continuous monitoring. And so from a payment perspective, that's sometimes the challenge is, in a fee for service world, it's figuring out, it has to make sense financially, right? Because as good as the benefit as it can potentially provide for a clinic, if they're in the red, then, that benefit just kind of outweighs for the vast majority of kind of the systems the way it is. And so from a device perspective, normally, the device themselves is an important component, but it's less important as the, kind of the device to a system to be able to kind of view automated workflow, automate codes and things like that. So normally what I've seen in successful programs is, the device is a kind of, one-time cost. And the cost is normally to the organization, because the way Medicare set this up actually is they understand that there's some cost associated with this, and that's why they're reimbursing the physicians. But the cost kind of goes in. So the patient doesn't normally pay for the device, so to speak, but they pay to be a part of the program. And normally that's via your traditional 80%, 20%. So the patient kind of is on the hook for a typical 20% copay if they don't have any secondary insurance. And that becomes, again, another challenge for adoption. You spoke about adherence or adoption. So, roughly it can be anywhere from $10 to $20 per month to be a part of an RPM program. Again, assuming a Medicare patient doesn't have any secondary insurance to be able to pick up, that.
Yeah.
And through COVID, there are ways that, you can kind of drop that code, but it's some uncertainty there. So I would say, from a patient perspective, it does add up. And so, that could be reasons for dropping out of the program. And I know there's a lot of, legislation and feedback from doctors to figure out a way to kind of lower that burden, potentially in the new kind of upcoming cycle year. But from a payment perspective, that's there. Now on the physician side, since they're kind of, getting reimbursed and taking on a lot of the cost, I think that it's a difficult way, of balancing. We want kind of the best device, but we really kind of want a more all-inclusive platform, because the device itself is only one kind of very small, minute way. But what if we want multiple devices? So that's kind of, the predicament that they go. And I've seen people do it ways where they bundle everything in together. But it does become a challenge, because to use a specific example on the device, that patient might need BP cuff, scale, a glucometer. But unfortunately, the way that these kind of, limitations of the codes themselves, that patient can be reimbursed for RPM as kind of a one program, right?
Exactly.
So from a cost perspective, now, you're running into the red, because that patient truly needs all of those devices, and it's going to help them from an outcome perspective. But there's the balance. They've kind of shifted the balance and the onus on the physician practices to kind of, manage some of those. And some companies really offer very cost-effective ways. The devices, I will say, have gone down significantly in cost, even the cellular enabled, so that it still is realistic from a pricing perspective, with software plus hardware. But it is kind of a challenge, and in my opinion, somewhat of a limitation, to truly move the needle from a clinical perspective when you're balancing kind of the traditional fee for service of, really it's built to kind of monitor one or maybe two vitals. When you have a patient with complex comorbidities, it does become, a tough option to figure out which, what devices, and is it going to be cost effective for the practice?
Yeah. Are there instances where, let's say it's a short-term use or something like that, and these physician groups are buying maybe 3 or 4 blood pressure monitor cuffs or something like that, and then they're sending them out with patients and then getting them back after a certain period of time, and doing their due diligence to disinfect or whatever, and then sending them out with another group of patients? Or are these things really kind of like, once they're in a patient's home, they're in a patient's home, and they're not coming back?
Yeah, so I've seen, the what you described the first, with certain, right? So for example, like a glucometer, with blood, right? It's a one-time use. But for BP cuffs and scales, there is some wear and tear, and I think particularly for short-term use cases, that's exactly what I've seen done successfully. And usually that's through a partnership between the practice and kind of the vendor, so to speak. And it's important to note, very rarely are the actual device vendors the one that are kind of incorporating that. So lots of different kind of, software companies or vendors in the RPM space, they're normally using different, devices, third-party devices. But in terms of all-inclusive program, what I've seen be successful is exactly what you just described, where, it's kind of a one-time cost, and there's some ways to mitigate the costs, because there's the setup code and things like that. And then there's some reuse there, but a lot of time that's kind of going towards helping set up a scalable program. And so having those best practices already in place for the office, seamless kind of logistics, right? Do you want it to go directly to the patient? Is it going to go to the office, or do we have that already? Because, offices don't have time to spend to create those protocols. So normally the successful kind of client or vendor and physician group relationship normally has all that kind of ready to go as a part of the overall kind of RPM program. So that's kind of an easy plug and play for offices.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we've kind of talked about remote patient monitoring, what it is, how it's paid for. Let's say somebody owns a practice and they're all about RPM. They want to implement it. What are the steps they need to take in order to get a successful program off the ground and sustainable?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think, it's a challenging one from a vendor process perspective, but I think it's being able to first identify, before we even talk about vendors or this or that, is evaluate kind of the bandwidth from a staffing perspective. I think it's super critical to do that first before even thinking about the patient populations or things like that. Now, luckily, the advantage, so doing that, step one is, can I do this in-house? Do I have the bandwidth, or is it going to stretch me thin with all the other ways I have to deliver kind of high level care there? So establishing that is going to be super critical because, luckily with the way Medicare set these codes up is they did allow understanding the burden. They did allow other vendors to be able to help out with the kind of the treatment management, the communication and caregiver. But it's important to determine that first of all, because when you go to kind of choose a vendor, so to speak, or be able to, set something up, you want to know that going in so that you can kind of, evaluate, do I need a platform? Do I need platform plus services? I think in a lot of times it's figuring out, do I have kind of the patient population for this, right? And so there's ways to kind of, send out on the front end, be able to send out, there's lots of patient surveys that go out, right? But it's probably good to be able to send out as, hey, in my area, would it even be worth it, right? Because if you have, no Medicare patients or, out of the, the hundreds and 500 Medicare patients, nobody wants to do this, then it's probably going to spin your tires even doing it in the first place. And that's easier said than done. But I think it's, hypertension patients, heart failure, being able to evaluate the conditions that might, be a fit for remote monitoring, because all conditions, right now aren't necessarily a fit. But, I've seen hypertension, heart failure, obviously diabetes, COPD kind of be some great conditions to start with there. And I think in terms of moving forward to kind of evaluate, there's lots of different, advantages and disadvantages when going in there. But I think from what I've seen, the most successful programs is having kind of a wish list of criteria, to talk with your staff and all the potential stakeholders in the office, taking that and then kind of going towards a very targeted vendor selection process, I've seen be good, because then you're going to know kind of very, very quickly what you're looking for, not necessarily what everybody else has, right?
Yeah.
Because there is an explosion of of good, bad, ugly, in kind of ways, for lack of a better term, ways there. And I think it's just there's just so many data. There's device manufacturers that do things good, and there's software that do things good. And so I think being able to have a nice criteria, I would say going with cellular over Bluetooth, I have seen, firsthand with lots of different programs, lots of different, vendors, be kind of a very successful way. So it might cost a little bit more, but in the long run, to patient adherence, adoption, that's kind of a must-have, at least in the outpatient ambulatory setting. And then I think from there, it's kind of finding a vendor that's really going to align with what you want to get out of a program. In terms of that, and then having the infrastructure. And then from there, it's really very important on the front end to make sure that, things like consent, that they have a good support system, so that when you kind of go live, so to speak, and you adopt this with your patients, that you have kind of a team of trusted experts that have done this in other areas and know kind of the pitfalls and shortfalls to look out for. And then in terms of, this is just a very anecdotally, kind of scaling up, right, is you're not going to go from 0 patients to 1,000 patients overnight. But there is kind of an interesting period that I saw where going from 0 to 100 is sometimes 100 patients, right? Kind of on a monthly basis or whatever else, or kind of adoption can be a difficult challenge. But kind of once you cross that threshold, we saw it across multiple organizations, specialty areas, that kind of 100 patient threshold was a success measure, that once you got there, it kind of was a little bit more smooth sailing. So I saw time and time again, nobody really jumped off the platform, and it could be it can take some steps to get there, but that was kind of a very, kind of a number, targeted number that we saw once we got there. Was kind of, you figured it out and you could kind of scale and had that in there. So there's lots of bits and pieces in there and different ways to, to do that. But
I was about to say, is that because more of the organization, by the time they hit 100, kind of had the processes in place and they were like, all right, we're good to go, we have it kind of nailed down, the system? Or is it a combination of that in combination with maybe patients talking to other patients and kind of just spreading the awareness, like in the waiting room, so to speak?
Yeah. No, I think it's a combination of both, but definitely probably on the office operations. And then from there, I think that there's ways, anytime you can kind of, educate the patient and give, leaflets and questionnaire, and it kind of spreads, particularly in a smaller community. That thing did happen. People were coming in saying, hey, I talked to Miss Smith, and I wanted to, be able to be a part of this program to monitor my blood pressure. So I think being able to have those dialogue and from a patient perspective, a lot of the feedback is that they just felt more connected to their to their provider and care team, right? And a lot of the outreach that was happening was kind of being able to eliminate the unneeded office visits and really focus on we had a great example of a family caregiver, and they had three siblings, and they had to plan their entire kind of weeks and months on taking loved one to the office for very basic checks. But whereas the remote patient monitoring program allowed the freedom in the caregivers to kind of really feel that same level of connection. But if there was an issue, knowing that there would be immediate reach out and that they wouldn't have to uproot their whole lives to kind of bring in mom, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's great. Kind of wrapping up here, how have you seen over the last little bit remote patient monitoring change kind of the healthcare industry insofar as like service delivery, and where do you see it going from here? Is obviously remote patient monitoring is here to stay, but what kind of an impact are we seeing kind of moving into the future?
Yeah, so it was interesting. I attended what's dubbed as the Future Healthcare the Health Conference, and it was a super hot topic. And I think it's important to note that there have been lots of good early adopters, right? But we're just kind of scratching the surface, of remote patient monitoring. They dubbed it remote patient monitoring 2.0, which looking back is going to kind of be, what's just called like treatment. Like it's just the way we treat patients. Which is really interesting. But I think that the common theme that I see is it's going to have to be truly innovative. Is there's going to have to be some ways to go outside of the realm of the current payment models, but the payment models are going to be important, right? Is it reimbursed? How's it reimbursed? Is there some flexibility? There's some new remote therapeutic monitoring codes that have been kind of proposed in the 2022 that will allow some different specialty areas, some more kind of freedom and flexibility potentially into this remote monitoring. One of the key areas though that I've seen a focus on, and so some of the companies will really have to be focused on being able to challenge is, very quickly they said that in a matter of a couple of years, could be even less than that, there's going to be more vital data streaming into the clinicians from outside the office or hospital than inside the office or hospital for the first time ever, right? And so that is a significant amount of data that has a very good chance of potentially burdening clinicians and doing the opposite of really what's the hope of RPM was. And so I think it's going to be very interesting. I mentioned there's lots of different wearables, and that's great. But I think what's going to be super critical is companies that are going to be able to solve for taking that large amount of data and be able to find ways to streamline into the workflow, but make this data truly clinically actionable to kind of make a difference from an outcome perspective, an economic perspective. So that's kind of what I'm looking for, and I'm sure there's lots of companies innovating in that space. But I think it's going to be super critical because we want to make sure that the data is kind of using to create better treatment, not just throwing lots of data into clinicians, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. I was just consulting with another company that's kind of in the space of wanting to try and do that, right? Like take all this data that we're getting, because we're getting it from everywhere, and try to streamline it onto like dashboards and maybe even using algorithms to have like actionable decisions that can be made based off the data, right? Because that's like level 2, if you would. Like we're just getting all this data. Now how do we take it and really use it to improve care?
Yeah,
Sure.
and I think that's really when a very broad term that's thrown around in healthcare is AI and machine learning. But I think that there's some real great already existing infrastructure and work that can do that to truly augment the care, right? Where it's not going to be able to pinpoint and still needs that clinician intervention, but it's just going to be able to cut down on the alarm fatigue and truly be able to kind of get to the right the right care at the right place, right? Which could be in the home. And we're seeing a lot of that through some RPM and then kind of the evolution to be able to watch for hospital at home, which, is similar, but is kind of a whole nother conversation with true acute level care at home. So I'm excited to be able to kind of, consult with some of the clinicians and be able to, really involve them in the decision making of how this evaluates. Because ultimately, there could be a world where it does take a little bit of a different, training method where you might have a clinician and a team of care nurses that that treat, but they're kind of monitoring some of the more centralized dashboards, and they need to be able to then kind of shift on how do we allocate our clinical resources to be able to take care of large amounts of patients, where in the past we had to just kind of episodically take care of 40 to 50 day in, day out.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool deal. Well, we're getting near the end here. So if there are like one or two main points or takeaways that you would want a listener to walk away with from the episode, what would they be?
Yeah, well, I think the number one takeaway I have is, is a lot of the success on the RPM program is still super important for for a lot of the pillars of a regular kind of, healthcare relationship, right? The physician, the caregivers, they are critical starting place, both from the start of the RPM program to kind of, making it work and making it truly make a difference for the patient, right? And so I think, the takeaway there is, patients, your doctor might or might not be exposed to, to this as a care modality, but they're normally very receptive if you ask them to potentially explore it out there as a starting place there. And then I think on the other end, a lot of the vendors, there's lots of people trying to solve this challenge, right? And so I think being able to to keep in the back of your mind the workflow of a typical whatever setting you're going into, right? Because a physician office to a health system, keeping those pain points in mind when you're trying to innovate in the space, I think is going to be super critical, because technology is great, but technology that's out of touch with really trying to solve a challenge or a pain point and truly innovate is much different. So I look forward to then and then also too, the last takeaway is kind of always kind of having the conversation with your local MAC and the regulatory components from a Medicaid, Medicare perspective is they actually take in a lot of that feedback, and so it's going to help shape kind of the reimbursement and the payment pathways that are kind of going to be RPM 2.0.
All right. Cool deal. Well, Josh, thanks so much for being on the show. If people want to find out more about you, more about Bioformis and all of that kind of stuff, where can they reach you and learn more?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can just find me, Josh Pappas, and I'm happy to share, my email, josh.pappas@bioformis.com. So my day to day, besides having this weirdly niche knowledge of RPM, I kind of work with health systems and enterprises for Bioformis as a director of digital health. So I'm always happy to connect and answer any questions and be a value add. So thanks again for having me on. This was awesome.
All right, cool deal. Have a good one.
Yep, sounds great. You too.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation about remote patient monitoring. Everything that entails, from the regulatory standpoint, from the data standpoint, from getting patients engaged and getting them to use and comply with the tools, to clinicians and how you bill for it and use it and implement it in your workflows. There's definitely a lot to think about. It's not as simple as just making the tool available and then hoping that it works, especially when it comes to cutting edge and innovative areas and treatment and delivery methods. It requires some training on the provider side, the payer side, and even sometimes the regulatory side, and then obviously the end user, which is either the patient or the clinician that's using it. It's funny, whenever I think about implementing a new tool or a new technology in the space, it's very simple, or it can seem very simple on the surface. Like, oh, this thing is going to make the clinician's life so much easier. They're going to be happy to use it. When in reality, there's a lot more at play, right? It has to work into the workflow and the efficiency, and it can't cost too much time or too much resources. It has to be something that the patient's going to actually use and adhere to. It's going to have to be something that payers are going to pay for, right? So it's definitely a tough nut to crack, but obviously the benefits of remote patient monitoring and that sort of branch of healthcare, if you would, are definitely validated and valid and worth pursuing. In fact, as many more payers move towards value-based reimbursement schemes or bundled reimbursement schemes, where you've got something like you get paid a lump sum per diagnostic code or something like that, it's not going to be as easy to do business as usual and just have the patient come in, primarily I'm thinking here at like ancillary services like physical therapy, occupational therapy, chiropractors even, where you have just your standard, we're going to see you twice a week for 6 weeks and that's going to get you over it. Because the way it's working now is if you're getting paid a lump sum for, let's say, low back pain being the diagnosis, you get paid a lump sum for that, whether you see the patient 16 times or 2 times, you get paid the same amount of money. So obviously you can see the incentives changing there on the provider side. But what we don't want is for the patient's outcomes, the quality of service and quality of care to decline because of those inadvertent outcomes or inadvertent incentives that are placed or put in place by the reimbursement scheme. I know we had Ron Baker and Ed Kless on the show a little while ago, and one of the things that Ed said was incentives matter, right? So anytime there's a new method of paying or a new business model or a new scheme, if you would, for reimbursing clinicians for the care that they provide, there are unintended consequences with the incentives that's provided or that's created by that reimbursement structure. So one of those incentives could be, and we actually had this conversation the other day at the clinic that I run, in that we work with a managed care organization, and they just moved to bundled payments for specific diagnoses. Basically, we do an evaluation, we submit that evaluation, and then that patient is then triaged by a nurse somewhere, I'm sure, and they're given a level. And that level indicates how much that insurance company or that payer is going to pay for the entire course of care for this individual outside of something like a recert or something like that, right? So we had the conversation the other day, and one of my billing person was like, well, we just need to stop seeing these patients, or we need to double them, or we need to, just leave the network altogether because it's just financially unviable. And my way of looking at it is, well, what can we do from a treatment standpoint, from a service delivery standpoint that still provides valuable care, that is still profitable for us so that we're not, digging a hole we can't get out of with each and every patient from this payer. But how can we innovate? And we've begun looking and exploring at things like asynchronous telehealth and telehealth service delivery and tools like that we have at our disposal that can still deliver high quality care and still make sure that the patient is meeting their goals, achieving the outcomes that we want them to achieve in a way that doesn't require direct hands-on care that costs money that's not being reimbursed, right? So anytime something changes like that, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to pull away from it altogether. But I think if we lean into the discomfort, if you would, or lean into just the unsteady footing or unsure footing of innovation, we'll be happy in the long run. So that's all I've got to say about that. Anyways, if you like the show, head on over to iTunes, leave us a rating and review. It helps people learn more about us, find us, spread the message, that sort of thing, all that good stuff. You can find the episodes that we have on the backlog or in the archive at www.rehabupracticesolutions.com/better-outcomes or betteroutcomes.show, and that'll take you to our page. You can find all the previous episodes, all the contact information, and links for all the show notes and the guests we've had on. You can sign up there, and we'll send you an email whenever we drop an episode. We usually drop them every other Wednesday. Sometimes when I'm feeling up to it, we'll get an off season or an off week bonus episode. Those are going to be few and far between here in the next little bit because I am working on the book. It's going to be tentatively called, well, I'm not even going to tell you what it's going to be called. The book by me is going to be out hopefully tail end of 2022. Just signed the agreement and getting that up and running. So I'm going to be spending every other waking period and free moment that I have writing and completing that book. So look forward to that. Anyways, if you want to, I know I mentioned this at the beginning, but if you run a healthcare organization, run a clinic or a department, and you're looking for a way to attract, acquire, engage, and retain more patients, if you're looking for a way to shift the focus of your organization from processes to people, reach out to us and learn how Rehab U Practice Solutions can help. You can find out more about working with us at www.rehabupracticesolutions.com. Or you can just go to the site, and I think there's multiple ways you can either schedule an appointment with me or reach out to my assistant, and we'll get you on the books. Until the next time, everyone, be safe, be healthy. I will talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to the Better Outcomes Show, where we explore the possibilities of a new healthcare. Our hope is that you walk away from each episode informed, equipped, and empowered to push the boundaries in your own practice or business. We want to give you the tools to help you build strong, long-lasting relationships with your patients and clients, helping meet their goals, improve their health, and achieve better outcomes. Learn more at www.rehabupracticesolutions.com. We'll catch you on the next episode.